Is God a person? Ridiculous question, you say? Obviously, God is not a person. God is God. Yet, if God exists, perhaps the most important question is whether God is a person. Here's why. Only a person has awareness, beliefs, intents, goals, relationships. Only a person does things for conscious, purposeful reasons. An impersonal force has and does none of these. If my hope counts, God exists and God is a person. But that's absurd, of course. My hope counts for nothing. But still, I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my journey to find out anyway. I begin at Notre Dame with Christian philosopher Thomas Flint. Tom brings careful rationality to deep theology. Tom, as I consider God and wondering whether God exists, the concept of God being a person is extremely important. What do we mean by that?
First of all, God has to be, to use a philosophical term, a substance. He has to have the kind of independence and autonomy that we think of ourselves as persons as having. Secondly, God has to know things. He has to have an intellect if he's going to count as a person. And I think furthermore, we'd want to say that God must have will, that he must be able to choose the actions that he's going to perform, and I would say choose them freely as well. So I think at least these three components are going to be, he's a substance, he has intellect, he has will. And of course, Christians would insist is perfect with regard to that intellect and will.
Substance, when we think of material substances, we think of things that have extension and take up space or move through time. Which, or if any of those, would carry over to God in an immaterial sense?
Right. There's clearly going to be no extension. Most Christians traditionally would say that there is nothing akin to parts within God. I mean, I think a standard old medieval definition would be to say that a substance is an ultimate subject of predication. It's sort of the thing to which the properties apply. We're talking about an individual, which might be another somewhat less technical way of speaking about what we're saying when we say that God is a substance. He's an individual who's not sort of part of or dependent on some other individual.
So let's go on. The second was intellect, knowledge.
His knowledge is so complete and so perfect that it's not the knowledge of a perceiver, it's the knowledge of a creator. We have to see at least part of God's knowledge flowing from his will. God knows what the physical world is like, for example, not because the world had to be that way, but because God freely decided to make it that way. It's his will that's bringing about the truths that his intellect knows. When I think of God as a person, I do think of him as a substance who has intellect and will. But I think when I don't have my philosopher's hat on, I think of him as a being who not just has willed to create this world, but loves this world that he has created. If we thought of God as a person and it was very abstract, but we couldn't think of ourselves as having anything like a personal relationship with him, well, it might do philosophically, but I don't think it would do religiously. So I think when I think of God, there's part of I naturally think that maybe
For Tom, for God to be a person, God must be a substance. Meaning God has independence and autonomy. God must also have an intellect and a will. And that's all it takes? Is that too simple for describing the creator of all existence? When it comes to God, if God exists, I oscillate between loving and hating simplicity. Mostly, I love it. But in Christian theology, there's more. The Christian God is apparently triune, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, three parts of the Trinitarian personhood of the one God. On this mystery, I confer with J.P. Moreland, a philosopher at Biola University in Los Angeles, who defends traditional church beliefs with flair and flourish.
JP, how do you see God? What is God's nature? Is God a person?
I believe God is tripersonal, that is, He's three persons in one being. So what is a person? For our purposes, a person is a center of consciousness that has certain complex mental states, like certain kinds of thoughts, feelings, desires, and beliefs. God is one being with an essence. Now, what's an essence? An essence is a thing's attributes that make it what it is. So Fido has the essence of a dog. I have the essence of a human. Your essence is your whatness. Now, there's only one being that has the essence of God. That is, there's only one God that has the attributes of omnipotence, omniscience, who is all loving and all just, but there are three centers of consciousness. There is a community of three persons within that one being.
Is that like saying there's a dog with three heads?
You can use that analogy, but all analogies break down at some point. When two individual humans have the same humanness, it forms distinct substances. But when the Father, Son, and Spirit have the same divinity, it doesn't form three distinct beings. It's all a differentiation within one being.
And they can be in three separate spatial dimensions. Certainly Jesus had a body, he had a spatial dimension, right?
No. Yes and no. What you're confusing is, in the incarnation, Christian theology teaches that the second person of that three persons, who tapped into a divine nature, added alongside a human nature. So that when we ascribe Jesus being located and weighing and eating, we're describing that the person Jesus insofar as he had a human nature. We're not localizing his divine nature. So when God became man in Jesus, the divine nature didn't become human nature. You have a human nature, so you got to keep the attributes distinct.
But by having three separate centers of consciousness, you don't have one thing. You have three separate things.
Well, you have three separate persons within a substance. Here's why this is important. Physics does not get at the fundamental nature of reality. Psychology does. It is the study of persons and their nature that gets at the fundamental being. Being a person is a huge thing. Persons aren't emergent specks on a sea of physicality. Persons are fundamental beings to which bodies are given. We are not human beings trying to have a spiritual life. We are spiritual beings trying to have a human life. And so the fundamental reality in the universe is a tripersonal being, which means that individuality and community are both primitive. They're both basic in the Godhead.
And they are all coexistent in time in the same
Absolutely.
way?
Yes.
So why is one the Father?
Well, he has different attributes.
And being a father, you don't have to have any pre-explanation or pre-time or anything. You could be coterminous, be exactly at the same time, but one be the father.
That's right. And so...
Would they choose up sides and he got the long straw or something?
Well, I will tell you this. I'm dead serious when I say that I think there is great hilarity and joking that goes on among them. And I think the life of God is so staggeringly rich and interesting and fun that very few people have any idea of how rich God's life is.
Well, looking at my life, I'm sure they have a good laugh.
There you go.
So the tripartite God, according to JP, is one being with three centers of consciousness, one divine substance of three persons. Perplexed? Then I'm not alone. The Trinity has perplexed theologians for millennia. JP's explanation, or justification, is as good as I've heard. But isn't God supposed to be one? Literally one? One person? What about Judaism, with its radical monotheism? I visit a synagogue in New York to ask a rabbi in the conservative movement, Neil Gillman. Trained in philosophy and influenced by existentialism, Neil takes the Hebrew Bible as a social construct, not as the revealed Word of God.
Neil, is God a person in Judaism?
Yeah, as long as you understand personhood as a metaphor. Look, there are Jewish theologians, Jewish philosophers today who insist that we speak of God as person, entering into interpersonal relations. Martin Buber, I and thou. This thou is very personal. In opposition to Jewish process theologians, for example, who will speak of God as a force, not as a noun, but as a verb, as activity. When I pray, I very much want God to have feelings and to be a person and to hear and to relate to me in a very personal way. When I do philosophy, I want God to be beyond personhood.
And that's a tension.
That's the tension. That's what you live with all the time. I'm in and out of each of these roles. I am a human being who worships and has a relationship with God, I hope. And then I go into the classroom and become a philosopher. And then I'm worried about being too concrete, too vivid, and diminishing God's transcendence. And then I work with my head. It's really word pictures that speak to my head and some that speak to my heart, and I need both. And I think the interesting thing is that the Bible is very free with attributing feelings to God. God is angry, God is pleased, God is frustrated, God is disappointed. I think God is vulnerable. God allows God's people to injure, to disappoint, and comes back for more. In a sense, God has failed consistently through the Bible. Failed with Adam and Eve, failed with Cain and Abel, failed with the generation of the flood, failed with the people that God took out of Egypt. It's a history of failure. This is not a hugely successful God, but this is a God who keeps trying, who never lets up. His frustration gets transformed into yearning, endless yearning, and hope and expectation that things will be better.
I feel Neil's tension, sense it grip my body. I too would want God as a person in prayer, more than a person in philosophy. The more Neil struggles, the more I like him. But as for reaching the reality of God, if there is such a reality, all this, I fear, is irrelevant. Must I seek further from home? If the Jewish God stresses God's interactions and vicissitudes, the Hindu God stresses God's immutability and transcendence. I am in Washington to meet physicist V.V. Raman, whose writings on religion are colored both by his science and by his Hinduism.
V.V., if we ask from the Hindu tradition and ask about God, is it even legitimate to ask the question, is God a person?
What one says in the Hindu tradition is that the divine has a physically visualizable dimension and the abstract dimension. It is not whether God is a person, but that God or the divine has a personal dimension through which we can better appreciate and experience the divine. Using the icon, or what they used to call idols, is the first step towards recognizing the divine. And then it goes on to say that the next one is by chanting, and ultimately it is by meditation on the abstract, on the universe as a whole. So these are different steps in the recognition.
In the Abrahamic traditions, one of the benefits, if you will, of having a personal God is to enable this relationship that we are to have with Him. What is the corresponding sense in Hinduism?
In the Hindu world, it is precisely the same, except that the tradition or the wisdom of the sages of the tradition say that this kind of a personal relationship is only one dimension of spirituality. It is a necessary one in the initial stages. It is a useful and powerful one, but it is still getting only a partial vision of what this cosmic experience is all about. The oneness with the universe, which is very different from the kinds of personal interactions. So that is the Hindu way of looking at it.
Eastern religions emphasize cosmic connections to a non-personal cosmos. A personal God? That's for beginners, say Eastern sages. Am I a beginner? After so many decades of search and struggle, now known as a neophyte. I don't mind. I'm just getting started. But I am getting tired. Can East and West be reconciled? To inquire, I go to Harvard Divinity School to ask Philip Clayton, a pioneer in reconstructing Christian theology in dialogue with philosophy and science. Those who disparage theology as never advancing, never progressing, have never listened to Phil.
The starting point for me as a metaphysician wouldn't be to hand us God as a full-scale person analogous to human persons right at the outset.
Intentions, beliefs, desires, and all that.
Yeah. I think the philosopher of today, whether he or she is a professional philosopher or pursues it as an amateur sport, has to be much more cautious, has to be worried about anthropomorphisms, projecting our own qualities onto the divine. Sure. So let's start as minimally as possible. Let's start with a question: is this universe as we see it grounded in something in any way, or is it what you see is what you get? Let's imagine that I could convince you that it made sense to look for some sort of ground. So we understand the things that we see around us as results of some fundamental ground in which everything holds its reality. And then I want to ask, how should we understand this ground and its relationship to all else? Are we justified in understanding this ground as more like a person, so with person-like qualities, or more impersonal, or maybe a balance of the two?
The issue is whether that entity that has this infinite, eternal, all-powerful, all-knowing, everything, also has the characteristics of a person, the beliefs and intentions and desires and will and all of these things that we characterize ourselves by.
That's right. And I guess for the metaphysician of today, the starting point is probably it's impersonal, because you don't seem to need personal qualities to ground the physical laws that have given rise to emergence that have produced us.
Right.
So I actually would say the burden of proof is on people like me who think that that ground should be understood as having something like personal qualities.
But now, what do we do with that? Can we make any progress?
Well, if emergence is right, Persons have evolved out of non-personal forces early on in the process. So it looks like science has explained away personhood in terms of more fundamental laws, right? Well, then we ask, what about the universe as a whole? This universe that has produced persons, is it fine-tuned for the projection of persons? Well, as you know, it turns out that if there are many universes, then in a few, like ours, there could be persons, and countless, infinite number of other universes, no persons at all. So no argument to a personal God would seem to follow. Right? But if it turns out that this multiverse theory is mistaken, there's only one universe, then the fine-tuning to produce persons would suggest a source or ground that itself had person-like properties.
Even if our existence is an accident of evolution?
Right. We would still have to ask why the universe was structured in the way that it is to produce persons. And that would lead us to postulate a structuring force with intentions, which would be a person-like ground. I want to know if the ground can be understood as mind-like. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that if there are laws that cover over a whole range of universes, they must be located in some source which is more like mind than like non-mental reality.
Okay. Now, can you then make the next step from mind to personal characteristics, intents, beliefs, purposes? Can you do that?
You see, for the metaphysician of today,
if you can't do it, you can't do it.
We have to be more cautious.
Okay.
So mind-like is already a huge step. Maybe that's as far as we can go.
Okay.
Maybe, though, something that has mind might also have intentions. That is, to plan, to intend something and then to carry out that intention.
Can you have mind without intentions?
See, it wouldn't be mind in that case, would it?
I'm asking, I don't know.
So, minimally, I'm not looking for a full-bodied theory of personhood, but the most minimal understanding of what that ultimate source of all things might be.
What is the minimum characteristics of a mind to make it defined as mind rather than something else?
3 things.
What do you need? Okay, good, I'm listening. I'm ready to count.
Intentionality, awareness, and thought or rationality.
Can you go further than that? Can you have the personal kind of God who's personally aware about your life?
Yeah, and the reason why I would have us pull back from a robustly personal understanding of this ultimate is we always have to hold as a counterbalance the positions taken by, say, Buddhists and Hindus, which is that the ultimate source includes personal and non-personal attributes. If we can understand the ground of all things as even being minimally mind-like, that may have to be our resting place.
That's a huge step by itself.
But at least that gives us the sort of framework that helps us to account for the existence of this universe or multiverse and the sorts of laws that would produce us in the first place.
Minimally mind-like, the final resting place for the ground of all being, for God. I do not know, but I will assume that God exists in order to examine whether God makes sense. Does it make sense for God to be a person? I surely want God to be a person. How else could God protect us, give us life after death? But constructing the ineffable divine by projecting our feeble images seems radically distorting. Each religion frames its own image of God. In Judaism, God is very personal, very human. Pleased, disappointed, frustrated, angry, even failing and beginning anew. In Christianity, person is fundamental reality, God and human. But the Christian claim goes further. God is one being with 3 persons, a mystery. In Eastern religions, God is cosmic, transcendent, and unchanging. And while God as a person may aid neophytes like me, God's own reality is not as a person. Amidst confusion, I respect caution. And to find that the ground of all being is at least minimally mind-like would be achievement indeed. But if that were all, if God were not a person, I'd not be happy, even if closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.